jumping at the break of day.
Here is what the 1950s looked like from the outside. Poodle skirts, crew cuts, Eisenhower on the television, and a kind of scrubbed clean surface calm that the decade became famous for.
Baby, you know I do, but I've got to see this book of love, find out why it's true.
But underneath all of that, on the street corners of Harlem and Newark and Chicago's South Side and Philadelphia's row house neighborhoods, something extraordinary was quietly taking shape. Teenagers with no instruments and no money were stacking their voices on top of each other in housing project stairwells and church basements and subway stations, inventing a sound so tender and so perfectly human
Down tight from within a dim light cast to silhouettes on the street.
that it eventually split the pop charts wide open. They called it Doo-Wop, and the best of it could break your heart in under 3 minutes. These are 8 of the groups who built that world and who history has nearly forgotten. The Silhouettes. Richard Lewis wrote, "Get a job," while he was stationed in Germany in the early 1950s, a young soldier in the US Army whose mother had once told him, with some urgency, to get a job when he came home. He carried the lyric around for years, formed a gospel group called the Gospel Tornadoes after his discharge, talked his bandmates into going secular, and eventually recorded the song in October 1957.
I was sore, let me in, all else I'll be down your door.
At Robinson Recording Laboratories in Philadelphia as the B-side to a ballad called I Am Lonely. Their manager, Kay Williams, also a disc jockey at What Radio, which probably didn't hurt, pressed it on his junior label, and the response was immediate. After Dick Clark played Get a Job on American Bandstand, 200,000 orders came in overnight. The song was licensed to Ember Records. It hit #1 on both the Billboard Pop and R&B charts in February 1958, and it eventually sold over 3 million copies. The doo-wop revival group Sha Na Na took their name directly from its opening hook, and the song later appeared in the 1978 film Grease, introducing it to an entirely new generation who had no idea they were watching history. The Silhouettes never had another hit. They spent years fighting to recover the publishing rights that had been quietly siphoned away while they were young and grateful and not yet wise to the industry. Lewis finally received his first royalty check in 1987, a full 30 years after the record was made. Sometimes success arrives faster than justice. The Flamingos. The Flamingos formed in Chicago in the early 1950s. Cousins Jake and Zeke Carey pulling together a vocal group from their South Side neighborhood that specialized in a kind of impossibly refined, eerily beautiful harmony that set them apart from the beginning. They spent years recording prolifically Chance, Parrot, Chess, Decca, End, building a reputation among musicians and music lovers, while commercial success remained just out of reach. Then, in 1959, they recorded a version of I Only Have Eyes for You, a standard originally written for a 1934 Busby Berkeley film musical, and something extraordinary happened in the studio. Producer George Goldner encouraged the group to soak the track in deep reverb echo, building a sound so immersive and otherworldly that the Billboard reviewer, rather underselling the situation, called it organized confusion. Terry Johnson's 3-chord jazz intro shimmered into Nate Nelson's melting tenor lead, and the background harmonies drifted in and out like something half-remembered from a dream. It peaked at number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on R&B in the summer of 1959. Rolling Stone ranked it among the 500 greatest songs ever made, placing it at number 158, higher than most songs recorded by artists who are actually household names. The Grammy Hall of Fame inducted it in 2003. The Flamingos were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. What they created in that studio, a song already 25 years old, completely transfigured into something no one had ever heard before, remains one of the most hypnotic recordings in American music history. Sometimes the oldest song in the room is the one with the most to say. The Moonglows. Harvey Fuqua grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, the nephew of Charlie Fuqua of the Ink Spots, which meant music was in the walls of his childhood before he could read. In 1951, he drove up to Cleveland with his friend Bobby Lester, started putting a group together, and eventually landed in the orbit of a fast-talking disc jockey named Alan Freed, who renamed them the Moonglows and managed them into a record deal.
I love you, that's why.
After a year of struggle at Chance Records, including a beautiful, ignored cover of Doris Day's Secret Love, they moved to Chess Records in Chicago in October 1954, and their very first session there produced 13 songs, including one that would define them, Sincerely, with Bobby Lester singing lead in a voice like warm rain on a window pane, hit #1 on the R&B chart and broke through to number 20 on pop. The McGuire sisters covered it almost immediately for a white audience, and their version outsold the original, a fact that says everything about how the music business treated black artists in 1954. Fuqua went on to mentor Marvin Gaye and become a pivotal figure at Motown. The Moonglows were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000. Their contribution to the sound of American music is almost impossible to overstate, and almost nobody under 40 knows their name. Sometimes the foundation is the last thing anyone thinks to credit. The Turbans. Philadelphia in 1953 was lousy with vocal groups. Kids rehearsing on stoops and in rec centers and anywhere the acoustics felt right. Al Banks, Matthew Platt, Charlie Williams, and Chet Jones were 4 of those kids. Teenagers from the downtown neighborhood around Bainbridge and South Streets who had been stacking harmonies together until something clicked. They won a local talent contest at Christmas of 1954, singing a doo-wop version of White Christmas, which was enough to get a demo into the right hands. Herald Records signed them in the summer of 1955, and the A-side of their first single, a stiff, forgettable ballad called Let Me Show You Around My Heart, went precisely nowhere. But a disc jockey flipped the record over, put the needle on the B-side, and When You Dance started moving. It climbed to number 3 on the R&B chart and cracked the Pop Top 40. What makes the Turbans genuinely irreplaceable isn't the chart position. It's this. Music historians have identified When You Dance as the first hit record to use the syllables doo-wop in its refrain. The genre was literally named, in part, after a line in a song that was only supposed to be the B-side. They never charted again. Sometimes the whole world takes its name from something nobody meant to create. The Five Satins. In February 1956, a 19-year-old soldier named Fred Paris was stationed in Philadelphia, working guard duty on a cold winter night, and he couldn't stop thinking about a girl back home in New Haven. He had spent a weekend with her the previous spring, and the memory of it had lodged somewhere he couldn't reach. He wrote the song on his train rides between Philadelphia and New Haven, just 2 verses and a bridge, and shortly after, on a brief leave, brought his group into the basement of St. Bernadette Catholic Church in New Haven to record it on a couple of tape recorders, with a saxophonist who was simply a parishioner at the church. They called the song In the Still of the Night, misspelling Nite, to avoid confusion with a Cole Porter standard. It was released on a tiny local label in the spring of 1956, became the #1 listener-requested song on Alan Freed's nightly show on Winds, New York, climbed to number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on R&B, and sold 1 million copies. Fred Paris wasn't there for any of it. He'd already shipped out to Japan. He watched from across the Pacific as a reshuffled version of his group toured America on his song, performed it on American Bandstand, and took his name through dressing rooms and television studios he would never see. He returned from the Army in 1958, formed a new version of the Five Satins, and kept performing for decades. In the Still of the Night is still considered by many critics the greatest song doo-wop ever produced. The girl it was written for, Marla, eventually went to California and never came back. Sometimes the most perfect thing you'll ever make is the thing you made because you had no choice. The Monotones. 6 teenagers from the Baxter Terrace Housing Project in Newark, New Jersey, all attending high school together, had been singing together since 1955. I'm crying, my port is dying, and had even won first prize on Ted Mack's Amateur Hour. In 1957, their lead singer, Charles Patrick, was browsing for sheet music when he heard a Pepsodent toothpaste commercial on the radio. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent, and something clicked. He went home and worked up a new lyric with 2 bandmates, Warren Davis and George Malone, built around the question of who wrote the Book of Love. They performed it at a show, noticed the audience reaction, got nervous that a rival group might steal it, and rushed into the studio to record it. Even then, there was another version of the song's origin, a claim that 15-year-old Pearl McKinnon of the rival Kodaks had contributed the melody, and the Monotones quietly absorbed the story and recorded it anyway. The Book of Love was released on the Tiny Mascot label in late 1957, went viral before that word existed, overwhelmed Mascot's capacity to press copies, was re-released on Chess Records' subsidiary Argo label in February 1958, and climbed to number 5 on the pop chart and number 3 on R&B. It sold over 1 million copies and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's list of 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. The song even became the theme tune for the Newlywed Game on American television, playing into living rooms across the country for years after the Monotones themselves had vanished from public memory entirely. The Monotones never charted again. Sometimes the most enduring question is the one you asked as a joke. The Chantels. Arlene Smith had performed at Carnegie Hall at 12 years old. By the time she was in high school at St. Anthony of Padua in the Bronx, she had been singing with the same 4 girls, Lois Harris, Sonia Goring, Jackie Landry, and Renee Minus for more than 7 years, training on Gregorian chants in their school choir with the kind of classical precision that most adult singers never achieve. In the summer of 1957, they were discovered by Richard Barrett of the Valentines and signed to End Records. Their first single, He's Gone, reached number 71 on the pop chart. For their second session, on October 16, 1957, Barrett booked not a regular studio, but a refurbished church in Midtown Manhattan, specifically for the acoustics. They recorded a song called Maybe, written by Arlene, with Barrett and label owner George Goldner eventually claiming partial writing credits in the manner of the era, and it took 52 takes before Barrett was satisfied, leaving Smith in tears by the end. Released in December 1957, Maybe climbed to number 15 on the pop chart and number 2 on R&B, sold over 1 million copies, and earned a gold disc. The Billboard reviewer who first heard it described it as organized confusion that had to be heard to be believed, which may be the most accurate review ever written about a record that changed the shape of popular music. Rolling Stone has since described Smith as the greatest female vocalist in the history of rock and roll. It was the first song by a girl group to sell 1 million records. Arlene Smith left the group in 1959 amid internal disputes and never recaptured that commercial moment. Sometimes the voice that defines an entire era is the last one to be given its due. The Heartbeats and Shep and the Limelites. No other act in Doo-Wop history did what James Shepard did, not across one song, not across one group, but across an entire decade of connected recordings that told a single story from beginning to end. 1,000 miles away in 1956 was the departure, a man aching for a girl who had left for Texas. 500 miles to go in 1957 was the journey. Then Shepard left the Heartbeats, formed a new trio called Shep and the Limelites, and in 1961 released Daddy's Home: The Arrival, the man finally returning to the woman he loved. It hit number 2 on the Billboard, Hot 100, and number 4 on R&B. The sequels kept coming. 3 Steps from the Altar for the wedding, Our Anniversary for the celebration, What Did Daddy Do for the first doubt. It was the first song cycle in rock and roll history, a 6-year, multi-group narrative told entirely in 3-minute doo-wop ballads, and almost nobody has ever connected the pieces. Most listeners who know Daddy's Home have no idea it is the 4th chapter of a story that began 5 years earlier with a teenager writing a letter to a girl in Texas who had stopped writing back. Shepard was shot and killed in his car on January 24, 1970, on the Long Island Expressway during a robbery attempt. He was 34 years old. The story he had been telling, one record at a time across his entire adult life, was left unfinished. Sometimes the most ambitious work of art in a genre is the one nobody noticed was a single work at all. Doo-Wop was built by teenagers with nothing but their voices and everything to say. These 10 groups didn't just make music, they made something that outlasted them, outlasted the decade, and outlasted the industry that mostly failed them. Which group deserves to be remembered most? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about the music history almost swallowed whole.